What's going on everyone, welcome back to another spec check. In tonight's video we're going to be looking at the DC2 96 spec Integra Type R and the 98 spec Integra Type R DC2, so stay tuned. So welcome again to another video. Tonight, as I say, we're going to be looking at the two iterations, if you like, of the DC2 Integra Type R. We will be focusing on the JDM variants of the cars because there's so many different variations between the UK market, the US market, the Japanese market, different power outputs, slight differences in all sorts of spec levels and trim levels, things like that. So we'll just be focusing on the Japanese variants of these two cars, where the car originated from and where it started in 1996. So first things first, we'll cover the similarities. Both cars put out 200 PS, although there were slight differences in the power ranges, and we'll get there. Both cars were seam welded from factory like the EK9 was, and both were sports orientated cars built actually for Group N competition. Both had lightweight wheels, lightweight sports seats from Recaro. Even the front windscreens were actually slightly thinner on the Integra Type R chassis to again try and reduce weight. Both were fitted as standard with limited slip diff gearboxes, and the Integra Type R DC2 chassis is still renowned for being one of the best handling front wheel drive cars ever made. From the ground up though, going into the differences now rather than the similarities, we know quite a lot about the DC2 and its spec overall because of how legendary it is in the car community, especially amongst Honda enthusiasts alike. But the differences are where the 98 spec really comes into its own. First things first then, from the ground up, we went from a 195 55R15 tyre, very much like the GSR Integra and the Honda Civics at the time, to a 215 45R16, increasing that contact patch by 20mm per corner or 40mm per axle, and giving us better grip overall. We went from a 4x114 PCD to a 5x114 PCD, so a 4 lug to a 5 lug improvement if you like. Stronger axles, we went from a 32mm stub shaft where you would normally bolt into the hub assembly itself. We went from a 32 to a 36mm, just a small increase to make it more robust. The brakes now, that is an area that was definitely improved upon. We went from the normal sort of GSR style brakes, 262 up front, 240 in the rear, similarly on the EK9 or EM1 Honda Civics. We went from that brake size and brake setup to something more like the Honda Prelude or indeed the EK9 at the time in 97 when that was released in the 98 spec DC2. We went to a 282 up front and a 260mm in the rear, slightly larger master brake cylinder from a 15/16 of an inch to a 1 inch brake master cylinder diameter, giving a lot better pedal feel, a lot higher up, that the same amount of braking pressure could be applied a lot earlier in the brake pedal travel. Honda also revised both the springs and the shock absorbers, although there's no real notable differences that I can find online. If you know any information about the spring sizes, shocker differences, any sort of spec differences, then please let me know in the comments. I'd be very interested to find out. But from what I've read, it's very, very minimal. That minimal that it's not even detailed anywhere. So it might be that the progressive springs on the rear axle, for example, were tuned slightly in their progressiveness as far as spring compression goes. Maybe something like that, but I'd be very interested, so let me know below. One of the very easily identifiable improvements though on the DC2 from the 96 to the 98 spec was that the front anti-roll bar went from a 24mm to a 25mm diameter, and likewise the rear anti-roll bar went from a 22mm to a 23mm on the rear axle. So a slight improvement, a slight upgrade if you like, slightly stiffer both front and rear axles. But yeah, as mentioned before, the spring rates, I believe they increased slightly by 0.1 kilogram per millimeter in both front and rear axles, but I don't know how else they were tuned, so please let me know. In the gearbox, both 4th and 5th were actually lengthened in the 98 spec DC2 because the final drive ratio that they gave in the 98 spec was made shorter. It went from a 4.4 final drive ratio to a 4.7, giving it better acceleration through 1st to 3rd, but maintaining a similar sort of acceleration, if not the same, for 4th and 5th gears, and it maintained the top speed. For specifics, we went from a 1.107 to a 1.034 ratio for 4th gear, and a 0.848 to a 0.787 for 5th gear. For the engine, power remained the same, and not many people know this, but there were revisions done on the engine, specifically on the camshafts and on the exhaust manifold. These small improvements gave it a much wider torque band, but also a lower peak power, and it maintained the power throughout a broader torque, throughout a broader torque curve and throughout a broader power curve for the revised B18C that was seen in the 98 Spec DC2. Those modifications then, the exhaust manifold for example, it's the most easiest to see the difference. It went from a 4-to-1 design, from that into a 4-into-1 design, so it gave that extra peak performance, but the revised camshafts, I believe, helped gain the broader power curve and lower down torque, as they were camshafts that were very similarly designed, if not the exact same design, as those that were featured in the B16B that was seen in the EK9. That was obviously meant for a lower displacement engine, but still achieved a very high power per litre for its time for a naturally aspirated engine. Weight wise, the 98 Spec DC2 did increase slightly by 20 kilos. Personally, I feel that's to do with the now stock and mandatory ABS system, possibly the larger brakes, slightly larger diameter anti-roll bars, and maybe even the larger wheels that would have had slightly larger tyres and therefore be a little bit heavier as well on each corner. Largely though, aesthetically they remain the same, and this video is more about the specifications and why you would choose something like the 98 Spec over the 96 Spec DC2 Integra Type R for its performance benefits and Honda's revisions, if you like, to that particular model. So that in a nutshell is the 98 Spec DC2 versus the 96 Spec DC2 specification differences. There are, as I say, some slight aesthetic changes. The bumpers were slightly different, especially the rear bumper, that's very easily visible. But yeah, it's pretty much a raw driver's car, and when they go into those sort of lengths to make the windscreen thinner but still meet crash regulations in the local area that it was made for, it's crazy to think about the lengths that they were going to try and keep that car so light, and it was a very, very light car at just over 1000 kg. So I hope you found this video useful. If you know anybody who's trying to find out the information between the two vehicle specs and the differences, then please share this video with them. If you haven't already, then please hit subscribe, hit the bell to get notified of future uploads like this if this is the sort of stuff that you're into. I'm very much into my 90s and early 2000s Hondas, so if you like this, please hit subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.
Makes the night